which is going to have a global impact. We're using up resources at a rate we never thought we would use them up before. There are non-renewable resources. There are whole species going extinct as a result of what human beings are doing to produce things. So there is also conflict between workers and employers around how we should organize a society. So there's a tremendous amount of costs, ecological costs, social costs. And again, there's nothing unique about that. Every system of production will have some costs to it. Now, Galbraith wants to argue, and he's looking at it in a broad way. He says, okay, well, how are those costs justified? Okay, there's lots of goods that are produced that we have access to. That's the good stuff. Here is what it costs us. How do we justify the costs, essentially? How do we count it? And he says the stress on the production of goods can be justified in two ways. Okay, why should we keep producing the way we're doing? It can be justified in two ways. He says, on the first hand, the argument that's given is, well, we need to have production because production creates jobs. That is, if we didn't make things, people wouldn't be able to work. So we need to produce so that people can make a living. It's an interesting argument. It's actually not the key argument because there's lots of different ways. If you just want to create jobs for people, there are many other ways of organizing society. You could have people doing all kinds of things, not just producing things. You could have them involved in all kinds of economic activity, all kinds of other social activity. So Galbraith argues, in fact, that's not the main one. Even though politicians talk about this a lot. They talk about how if this industry comes into this town, it's going to create this many jobs and it's going to generate this much taxes, etc. Even though politicians talk about that, Galbraith says it's not the main reason why you should have a society that is so focused on the production of goods. So focused on the production of things. He says that there's a second argument for that. He says the second argument actually is much more key. He says the reason we need to produce what we're producing is because that is what we want. The reason we produce so many things is because that is what people want. People want more and more things. And for Galbraith, that is why do we... Okay, we're producing so much not because it's going to keep us employed. We're producing so much because it's what we want. We want the goods that we produce. We want the goods that we produce. This is the basis of this is, and he says the second, philosophically speaking, this second argument, in fact, is absolutely fundamental. It's absolutely fundamental. This is also what's called the theory of consumer sovereignty. In fact, it's essentially the story that's told in most economics departments. It's essentially the story that's told in most management departments. That is, when it's a consumer sovereignty, the consumer is sovereign. That is, the consumer is in charge. And the reason we produce so much is because consumers want so much. This is what Galbraith calls, it's interesting, he says, right, the reason we produce so much is because we want it. Not because businesses are trying to persuade us to do things we wouldn't otherwise do, but because we really deep down want the products that come out of the marketplace. This is what he calls the accepted sequence. And he says it's called that is, things start off with consumers. And he calls this the accepted sequence because it is what is generally accepted. I said it's taught in economic schools, it's taught in business schools, etc., as why the economy functions the way that it does. Now Galbraith argues, he says, for the accepted sequence to be valid. Okay, for that it's a story. I mean, it's a story. The accepted sequence is a story. And as you know, stories could be right or they could be wrong. Depends, sometimes a story is not very valid, but it's told in a very compelling way, but it doesn't make it any more right. So I want you to get used to this idea of theories and stories, because sometimes we'll talk a lot about theories. A theory is just the fancy word for someone's opinion. The theory is just a word for a story, and everyone can tell a story. And so Galbraith says for the story of the accepted sequence to be valid, it would have to be shown that consumer wants originate with consumers. That is, we really want, that is, the wants originate with us. This is what he calls the accept. So this is the accepted sequence. I'm going to lay it out the way he does, in terms of sequence. Okay? If there are consumers, there are producers, people who make things, and then there is the market that is supposed to bring them together. Okay? And in this accepted sequence, the starting point is the consumer, who communicates, I'm never quite sure how, but somehow the consumer communicates in some magical way to the market what they want. And then in some other way, producers figure out what it is. That goes to the producers, and then producers produce what consumers want. But the starting point is always, the starting point in the accepted sequence is consumers. And then ultimately, the producers then will produce. Well, I said I'm never quite sure how this feedback mechanism happens and how consumers kind of communicate what they want to the marketplace. But it's the main story told about the economy we live in, so we should take it seriously. For Galbraith, so I said this, for Galbraith, he says, you have to show, remember, for this to be true, you have to show that things start with consumers. That wants originate with consumers. And he simply says, if that's the case, then the reason we produce so much is because consumers want so much. For Galbraith, however, he says the accepted sequence, how does advertising fit into this, he says. And for Galbraith, the accepted sequence cannot be reconciled, he says, with the existence of a massive advertising industry, the function of which he says is to create demand. You can't, within the accepted sequence, you can't have something, you have to account for what advertising does. How then does advertising fit into this idea of needs and wants? And for Galbraith, it's simply that the accepted sequence can't be reconciled with the existence of a massive advertising industry. Remember what he says. He says the function of this is to create demand. If you can go to quote number 1 from the handout today, that is, to bring into existence needs that would not otherwise have existed in the population. That's what it means to create demand, to make people want something that they wouldn't otherwise have wanted. Let's go to quote number 1 from the handout. He says, this is Galbraith, he says, consumer wants can have bizarre, frivolous, or even immoral origins. And an admirable case can still be made for a society that seeks to satisfy them. Stop there. He said, okay, this is not for him a moral judgment. He says consumer demands could be really weird and kinky and all kinds of things. Right? That's not up to him. But he says if consumer demands and were whatever they were, and you said, well, we're going to build a society that's going to cater to those demands. It's going to cater to what to consumers want. He said that'd be a fine. You can make an admirable case for that kind of society. He says. But, this is the big but now, but the case cannot stand. The case cannot stand if it is the process of satisfying wants that creates the wants. Okay, the process of satisfying the wants that creates the wants. That is, if you now show that in fact things don't start with consumers, but they start somewhere else, then you can't make that case that everything is for the good of consumers. He says, for then, the individual who urges the importance of production to satisfy those wants is precisely in the position of the onlooker who applauds the efforts of the squirrel to keep abreast of the wheel that is propelled by his own efforts. Okay, the squirrel wheel, the squirrel in the cage, and it runs on a little wheel, and can only run as fast as it'll run itself. You can't say, look how fast it's going. It's keeping up. Because it's only keeping up with whatever it's doing itself. And for him, he says that if you could show that wants came from somewhere else, then you can't say, what a great society. Look, we're giving consumers whatever it is they want. So what Galbraith does, creates what he calls the revised sequence. Okay, the revised sequence. And in the revised sequence, you've still got the consumer, you've got the market, you've got producers, the same as in the accepted sequence. But to this, you add advertising. And for Galbraith, now, the starting point, remember in the accepted sequence, the starting point was on the left-hand side, was with the consumer. For Galbraith, in the revised sequence, the starting point is the producer. Is the producer who, through advertising and who through their control of the market through advertising to consumers, creates wants and needs in consumers, and then the reason consumers go to the marketplace is as a result of their needs being created. Okay, totally different starting point. Totally different starting point. Now, according to Galbraith, actually, for Galbraith, this is if you're a producer, if you're the modern corporation, this is absolutely logical. That is, if you're a large-scale industrial corporation, you can't say what are consumers going to do now, and then you have to try, according to your own, you have to control the process. And one way you can control by leaving it to consumers is simply, there's too much uncertainty. And the best thing you can do is to try and, in fact, control, here is what you can produce, here is your supply, and then it is in your interest, your economic interest, to make sure there is enough demand to be able to satisfy what you've produced. Remember, whatever you produce, if you can't sell it, you're out of business. If you can't sell what you've produced, if you can't turn it back into a money form, then you are out of business tomorrow. And so you've got to figure out a way, says Galbraith, to predict what demand is. How do you predict what demand is? Well, one way of predicting what demand is by creating it. Okay, these are the two. Let's go back. These are the two. They both cannot be correct. They both might be wrong. But they both cannot be, these are the accepted sequence and the revised sequence are alternative descriptions of the same reality. They're alternative descriptions of the same reality. So we have to figure out which one of those. Now, if this is correct, then the reason we produce so much and the reason we have all these ecological problems, the reason we have global warming, etc., the reason we're running out of resources, the reason many people would argue America is in Iraq right now for making sure the oil is locked down. All of that is not because that's what consumers want. All of that is because that is what manufacturers and corporations want. Whereas, remember, the other perspective says, well, this is the other, which is the reason America is in Iraq, making sure the oil is locked down, is because consumers want all this stuff. And if you want to be able to provide this stuff for consumers, well, this is what it takes. So you could argue, you could look at Iraq from both those perspectives, but it depends where the starting point is. Now remember, if Galbraith is right, if Galbraith is right, we're looking at the critics. If Galbraith is right, the theory of consumer sovereignty is in major trouble. You can't say the major rationale for producing goods cannot be that you are satisfying needs that you yourself have created. You can't say that anymore. The political implications behind Galbraith's theory are important as well. That is, if the only reason we have all these incredible costs is because of what corporations want, perhaps if we look then and say, well, what is it that consumers really want? Perhaps we would come up with a different way of organizing society. Perhaps we would have less stress on the production of goods and more stress on investing in other things, investing in housing, investing in healthcare, investing in education, investing in a whole host of other things that consumers could also want. So if the political implications behind Galbraith's theory are in fact absolutely immense. One of the best historians of advertising is a writer called Stuart Ewan. And in fact, he's documented the way historically in which advertising emerged as a way to solve the problem for capitalism of overproduction. Remember, we actually started off with Marx's term, the immense accumulation of commodities.